Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Scott, and this is episode 3 of Gravity Nelson's How to Be a Pro Mechanic with Tools and Supplies You Already Have. Today we're going to be going over bike setup and covering things like saddle height, saddle adjustment, suspension setups, cockpit setup, adjusting brake levers, shifter position, as well as tire pressure. So this will be a lot of good information for you guys to help dial in your bikes and get them fitted to your personal preferences. All right, let's jump right into it with saddle height and position. So first thing, if you're running clip pedals, you're going to want to do all of this with your clip shoes just to make sure you're really dialed in with your feet in the right place. So I'm going to go ahead and throw my shoes on here. First thing we're going to look at is our saddle height. That's obviously the most important thing. Having the correct saddle height is going to give you the most efficient pedal stroke. So that means less work for the same output, or same work and more output. And there's a couple ways you can determine your saddle height. The simplest one I'm going to show you is basically sitting on the bike and using your heel on the pedal as a gauge. And you can do all of this stuff by yourself. Just set up next to a wall. That way you can lean against the wall, have both feet on the bike, and position yourself in a good, comfortable riding position and see how that goes. So I'm going to start by putting the crank arm all the way to the bottom, or kind of what feels like bottom, farthest away from you basically, and then put your heel on the pedal there, and it should be pretty much fully extended without rocking your hips too much. That way, when you have the ball of your foot on the pedal, you get a nice slight bend in the knee at the bottom of your pedal stroke. Now this is going to get you in the ballpark. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be pretty close. And just want to mention with saddle height that your comfort level is most important. So if you're new to this and having a really high seat like this makes you feel uncomfortable, you can start with your saddle height lower if being able to touch the ground is important to you, and then you can slowly work your way up to that correct pedal height as you become more comfortable with that higher saddle height. There are some cool methods of measuring your saddle height, taking some measurements of your inseam basically from the ground to your crotch and doing some calculation to get a rough saddle height approximation that way. I'll put a link to one of those calculators in the description of this video below. So now that we've got our saddle height fairly close, we can adjust the fore aft and also the angle of our saddle. With the fore aft, there's some certain things you want to look for. Most importantly, you want to have your knee, kind of the tip of your knee, directly over the spindle of the pedal when your crank is at the 3 o'clock position. So right here, my knee, if I were to drop a line from my knee, it should go just about straight over the spindle. And as I said, there's a lot of personal preference here, but I would recommend, if anything, erring on the side of too far forward than too far back. Having that nice balance will utilize all your muscles evenly to give you the most power and efficiency. This will also prevent some injuries. Last thing we can do with saddle height is the angle of it. And that, I would say, is almost 100% personal preference. So you're just going to have to fiddle with it and see what you like. Changes in your fore and aft or angle can, in the end, actually affect your overall saddle height as well. So once you get these set, you should go double check your saddle height again. Once you feel like you've gotten to a pretty good spot where you want to keep it that way, that's where you want to get a tape measure. Measure from the center of your bottom bracket, going straight up through the center of the saddle clamp, and then I'm finding my measurement to that point right there. So once we get our saddle height adjusted, now we can adjust our cockpit, and we're going to be basically trying to set everything so that all controls are easily reachable without moving your hands around. But first, we're going to want to adjust our handlebars, so getting them set to a comfortable width and also a bar angle. The trend these days is to have wider handlebars because wider handlebars give you a little more leverage, which gives you some more control. Although if you have sufficient upper body strength, you don't necessarily need that extra leverage to stay in control. And then having that narrower bar can give you a little more room to squeeze through trees and not get your handlebars caught up on things. So it isn't necessarily always better to go wider. Keep that in mind. Once you get your handlebar width dialed in, the next thing you want to adjust is the handlebar roll. And that's this angle here. And what I do is set the bike and look at it this way. And doing that gives you real good perspective for if the handlebars are just pointing straight back, if they're pointing straight up, or if they're at a nice 45. Generally the nice 45-degree angle is what I go for. That's most comfortable for me. Now that you've got your handlebars adjusted properly, we can look at our brake levers and shifter positions. Ideally, we want to be able to reach our brake levers with our hands in a neutral position. This is where I normally grip the bar. So I'll start here and stick my fingers out, and they should land right on the tips of my brake levers. A trick for getting a good even lever adjustment is to use a point of reference. So you can measure from the inside of your grip to the lever. A tape measure obviously works well for this. You can also just use a multi-tool, basically anything to just give you a reference point. So here I'm just gonna pull out one of these tools, lay it on here to where this end is up against my grip, and the other end I'm just gonna kind of mark it with my thumb here. I can see that it's right about at this silver point here, and then I can flip it over, check it on this side, and see that, yep, those are lined up. So they're evenly set on both sides. Your brake lever angle is going to depend on what your focus is in terms of riding. If you're focused on going fast downhill versus going uphill fast, you're going to probably set your levers differently. If you're focused on going downhill, a lot of your position on the bike, especially when you're descending, is going to be low, maybe a little bit more off the back, in which case your angle of your arm reaching the lever is much lower, versus when you're normally sitting, it's much steeper. So if your focus is going downhill, then you might have a lever position that's a little bit higher, and that's going to give you a good, comfortable reach when you're in an aggressive position going downhill. After setting the brake levers, we can adjust our dropper post lever and our shifter lever. And again, I'm just going to lay my hands on the bars in my normal position, and I should be able to reach my shifter paddles very easily from that position. But also, you can see when I'm not grabbing my shifter, my thumb, there's plenty of clearance between my thumb here when I'm just gripping the bar normally. So I don't have to worry about smashing my thumb or any part of my hand into my shifter lever when I'm just gripping the bar. And same thing with my dropper here in normal position, easy to reach. The angle of these is a little more preferential, although you should be able to reach it, but also push it easily as well. So just because you can reach it doesn't mean it's necessarily easy to push. You know, if this were rotated up here, that would mean I would have to be pushing the lever straight down to actuate it. In a normal position, my thumb naturally wants to push this direction. So I'm going to set my dropper and shifter lever so that they move in a natural arc as well. Something I've learned from my years of riding and racing is that grip diameter can play a huge role in arm pump. So if you're having trouble with arm pump, something you can try is some slightly thinner grips. No guarantee that's going to be a fix for you, but it's something pretty cheap and easy to try and could make all the difference for you. Next thing, I want to touch on tire pressure real quick. This is a tough one though because it's extremely variable. There are a lot of factors from the type of tires you're using, the diameter of the tires you're using, your skill level, the type of terrain you're riding, but there are a few things you can pay attention to help dial those in. For one, you should get yourself a digital pressure gauge. This is going to really help you when it comes to figuring out what you like, what your preferences are, what works best for you. What we're after here is finding the perfect balance of grip and support. Generally, lower tire pressure is going to allow your tire to mold itself to the surface of whatever you're riding on, if it's rocks, roots, grass, dirt, gravel, whatever, and grip that more easily. But lower pressure also means generally more rolling resistance and also a risk of pinch flats and rim damage. On the other end of the spectrum, higher pressure prevents those flats and prevents rim damage, can also give you a little more of a supportive feel in high-speed cornering, especially in berms or in jumps, in rhythm sections, but you lose a little bit of that traction. So you're going to have to play with it to kind of find that nice middle ground for you where you're getting good traction, good support, you're not hitting your rim. And that's where this is going to come in. You can find a good starting point, and then you can try going up a little bit, going down a little bit, try a little bit more pressure when you're riding bike park, try a little less pressure when you're riding wet, rooty sections, and just kind of get an idea of what works best for you. I also want to mention that digital pressure gauges are really good because standard dial gauges are pretty inconsistent. So if you're using a floor pump at home and then a hand pump on trail, those two gauges could be a couple PSI off from each other, which will make a big difference in your riding. So having this guy and always using something like this to check your pressures and maintain consistency across all pumps will really help you dial yourself in. Last thing I want to show you guys now is suspension setup for your bike. Suspension setup on a hardtail is pretty simple. I'd like to show you guys what's entailed with a full suspension. So I'm going to swap out my bike for my flatmate's bike here. And also I've got myself a shock pump. And just like I mentioned with TYRE gauges, these shock pump gauges are pretty inconsistent as well. So you should get yourself your own shock pump and try and always use that shock pump. That way you know you're getting consistency with one gauge. The starting point with any suspension setup, whether it's the rear suspension or the front suspension, is going to be sag. And that is how much the suspension sags when you're sitting on it with just normal static pressure. So like our saddle height setting procedure, we can do this by ourselves with a wall here to lean against. Start by compressing the suspension a little bit to get it active, and then just sit in your normal riding position and trying not to move your body too much. Slide the O-rings on the fork and shock all the way up to the seal. Now you can get off the bike carefully, trying not to compress the suspension anymore. And you'll be able to see what your sag was when you were on the bike. Again, there's the sag for the fork. Generally, for rear suspension, you'll be somewhere between 30 and 25% sag. A fork is considerably more variable, but I would say somewhere between 10 and 20%. If your fork and shock don't have nice printed sag gradients, you can always use a tape measure. You can measure the full stroke of the shock. In this case, looks like 55 millimeters, and then take 30% of that, and that's what this gap should be. And same thing with the fork. Measure the full stroke. So we're looking at 150, and then you want to take 10 to 20% of that. Once your pressures are in the ballpark, you can check your sag. We're going for a good middle ground here, not too fast, not too slow. So the suspension should be able to rebound quickly while still maintaining control. If when I compress the suspension and release, the tire wants to jump off the ground, that's probably too fast. You can do the same thing with the fork. You can see how the suspension rebounds nice and quickly, but in a controlled manner. The tire isn't bouncing off the ground when it rebounds. Having your sag set and your rebound set now, this is going to be a really, really good starting point. You're going to need to do quite a bit of fine tuning from here. And what you're going to want to pay attention to is the beginning stroke feel and end stroke feel of the fork and the shock. That sounds a little complicated, but with a little bit of time, I think you'll wrap your head around it. Beginning stroke feel, you want to pay attention to that small bump compliance. So when you're just pedaling along or going over smaller bumps, you want the wheels to track the ground nicely. And in terms of end stroke, you want to pay attention to those big hard compressions. If you're coming off of drops, hitting big jumps, smashing through some roots or rocks, that's where you're going to be using a lot more travel. So you don't want to be feeling the suspension bottom out at any point, but also you want the suspension to be absorbing as much of those impacts as possible. So you're going to have to adjust your pressures to find a good balance of those. If you end up having to deviate really far from that initial sag setup, then you're probably going to want to do some volume adjusting. Larger air volume will create a more linear feel. With a lower volume air spring, there's going to be a lot more ramp up at the end of the stroke, which will give you more bottom out support. Again, you're just going to have to spend some time making changes and seeing how they feel. Is your suspension feeling better? Is your suspension feeling worse? Does it feel the same? Use that questionnaire to help you decide what to do next. So there's a lot to think about when it comes to setting up your bike. And it's going to be a little bit of a tedious task, but if you really take your time with it, it's going to pay off quite a bit. You're going to be more efficient, you're going to be more comfortable, and most of all, you'll have a lot more fun out on the trail. So thanks again for watching, guys. If you have any questions or comments, please ask, and we'll see you next time.